As I said, it's entitled Infinity and Beyond, Exploring and Determining Limits for Gene Editing. The questions we're going to pose include, how do we debate and decide upon the future of gene editing from the perspective of limits, whether they're moral or ethical or technical or societal or religious? How do we define principles around acceptability and identify when we go too far? And what is the role of dialogue and debate in how we make these decisions and then how we make decisions that are actionable? So those are all things, very lighthearted questions that we're asking our final panel to consider. And that panel is moderated by Tamara Haspel. She's a journalist on food and science and writes the James Beard Award-winning Washington Post column Unearthed. When she's not doing the heavy lifting of journalism, she helps her husband on their Cape Cod oyster farm. So please help welcome to the stage Tamara and the panel, which will then be introduced once they're seated. Thank you.
Infinity and beyond, and we got an hour. So we're going to dig right in. Let's start by introducing the panel, and then we'll start. Randy, let's start on the end.
Good morning. I'm Randy Sprunk. I'm a farmer. I'm a crop and animal caretaker each and every day. So pleasure to be here with you morning, and thanks for the invite.
Kevin Fitzgerald. As you can see, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm also a Jesuit at Georgetown University. Typical of most Jesuits, I'm kind of an academic run amok. So a PhD in molecular genetics, a PhD in bioethics, and then a degree in divinity, because you have to have one of those to have one of these.
Very nice.
I'm George Church, a professor at Harvard and MIT, focusing on genomic technologies and also bioethics.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nemo Bossy. I train as an architect, but all my life I've been an environmental justice advocate. And I campaign on issues around why people are hungry, as well as issues about the irresponsible behavior of oil corporations.
So we have a spectrum. And I guess I want to start by talking about fear, because I have it on good authority that the producers of that new CRISPR, The Rock movie, Rampage, released it to coincide with CRISPRcon, so we would have a counterpoint to this sober, level-headed discussion about risks and benefits. Because while we're here talking about, public involvement in regulatory structures, they're talking about giant rats with superpowers. And although if we talk about what the genuine fears and risks are, it might not be the giant rats, but there are. There are legitimate fears. There are legitimate risks. And we've talked very little about it, although eugenics has flashed up on the screen a couple of times. And I guess I want to ask, if the whole reason we're having a discussion about ethics is that there's a downside here. If there weren't, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. What are you afraid of? What's the worst case scenario with this technology? Nemo?
I wouldn't say I'm afraid of the technology, just that I am suspicious of it. Now, there are many things that could go wrong with the technology because you are more or less giving over control of things that are not really controllable. We don't yet understand how genetic materials in our bodies, in the ecosystems interact. There's still a lot to be learned. And the speed with which the gene editing technology and other sort of similar technologies that are developing is so much faster than what is really known about the complexities of the situation. And I believe also that nature has a way of taking care of itself. We are not in control of nature. And if we think we can manipulate nature to the extent that we become masters of nature, we are certainly going to be surprised that nature will fight back.
But haven't we been manipulating nature all the time? Haven't we extinguished species? Haven't we brought things from other places? Doesn't the world look drastically different from what it did when we first got here?
You're absolutely right. I think human beings have been the most destructive species on Earth, and we've forgotten that when we call ourselves human beings, it presupposes that we know that we are just one of the beings on the planet. Mm-hmm. We are not the only beings here. And we've driven so many species into extinction, and this is a problem. This is a problem. And we are intimately actually related to many other beings, even the ones we don't see that live inside of us. And the thing is that the planet can do without us, and that may end up being the situation at the end of the road.
I hope it's not anytime soon. George, you're developing this technology. What scares you about it?
Well, I think that we should be cautious of all new technologies. We fortunately have government agencies that protect us, that we need to support those agencies. This is the EPA, USDA, and FDA in particular. And we need to support the international versions of that, World Health Organization, United Nations, and so forth. So we need to be cautious. Whether fear is helpful above and beyond caution, I'm not sure. But I worry about inequitable distribution, at least initially. I think we have examples of things that are eventually equitably distributed. Very few examples, but I think one is like smallpox vaccine. That's an example where we made something extinct worldwide. I don't think anybody is proposing bringing it back because we shouldn't be manipulating the wild to that extent. We certainly have huge agricultural even if you talk about conventional agriculture, it's had a huge impact on the world. And I worry that we can go too far or not go far enough. So there are some natural processes that I find very frightening, like 1,400 gigatons of carbon getting released from the Arctic. I think that's something, if we don't do something about that, it will make our worrying about 20 gigatons a year that we burn in our fossil fuels look like nothing.
Look like nothing, exactly. So given that this is such a powerful technology and it can do so much, how do we limit it? You mentioned our regulatory agencies, but from a strictly ethical perspective, let's put laws aside for a second and talk about how we can use this technology morally, what that means, and where we stop. Kevin?
Well, the answer to that is going to depend a great deal on what your goals are for the technology, but not just for the technology, what your goals are in general for your life, for the life of your loved ones, for members of your community, for other people around the world. So do we all share the same goals? Do we all share the same goods, what we consider to be good? And I think part of our conversation, which has been so rich these past 2 days, has been the recognition that we don't always share the same goods and goals. So how do we then address the fact that what might be a fear for one is actually something that's very enticing for somebody else? And how do we balance these different things? Well, again, I think if we step back and constantly ask ourselves, what are our most fundamental goals? What are the things we want to do most fundamentally in our world, and then start to say, how do we take this incredible technology and try to fit it to those goals, and yet avoid things that we would perhaps wish not to happen? So one of the things, and I agree, inequalities are going to be a huge issue. A sort of subtle eugenics can be a big issue. One topic I haven't heard about yet, which I find fascinating because it's been something that we've wrestled with on our planet over the past, say, 50 to 200 years, is waste. Every new technology creates a new waste, right? And there was a fascinating story, I think, that just came out of the news on Henderson Island, this little uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific that has all this trash on it that's just floated up, all the plastic that we've created that is just out there in the ocean. So what's the waste going to be from CRISPR and from genome editing? Who's going to be the waste? I mean, one of the things I've learned from agriculture, the definition of a weed is a plant that you don't want to be there.
Right.
So who are we, or what are we going to want not to be there? And how are we going to make that decision?
And I think all of these things sound important when we talk about, equity of access and all of these issues. But at some point, it has to come down to somebody deciding, what don't we do? what don't we allow? And that question came up when Feng Zhang was here. And his answer was, we don't mess with human embryos. And are there other things we don't do? Do you agree that we don't do that? If we have an opportunity to wipe out cystic fibrosis, do we not do that because we don't mess with human embryos? What don't we do, Kevin?
Well, again, I mean, if you look at the course of human history, there isn't much we don't do, right? Unfortunately, even the things we say we shouldn't do, we do. So how, I think the question is, more fundamentally, can we, at this point in time in our human development, come up with a way of saying, we are going to have increasing numbers of these powerful technologies that our science is going to be able to develop. Can we come up with a process, a mechanism, a structure, some kind of relationality that will allow us to address these technologies, again, getting back to that in a way that fits our most deeply shared goals? And I think we do have deeply shared goals around the world. I don't know a human being who says, I do not wish to be loved. I do not wish to be respected, right? So we do have some fundamental commonalities. The question is, just like it is with anything else, with war and violence and inequality and the rest, how do we now take these technologies and use this opportunity, which is really forcing us to wrestle with these questions, and say, how do we do a better job?
So let's talk about those deeply shared values, because thus far, I think the introduction of gene editing into our society has not really brought those to the surface. And one of the things about going last is that you watch previous moderators tick off your questions one by one. So thanks for that, Gideon. But fortunately, there's always more to say about the GMO debacle. And I think that it's the closest analog we have right now. It's the only thing that's sort of happened that has taken people there. And Randy, you were on the front lines of this. And I think that the way, although agriculturally we can talk about what this did for us, but certainly from the perspective of trying to find these deeply held goals that we share and coming to an agreement about how to use the technology, it was an unmitigated disaster. How did that play out in your backyard in Minnesota?
I thank you. Excellent question. And yes, really, that did play out. In other words, I started agriculture before the technology. I'm going to be honest with you, I adopted the technology. It's been very beneficial from my standpoint. We talk about the why. It's been very beneficial from the environmental standpoint, and we can also, show those things on carbon footprint, water footprint, that it's been beneficial. But I think where we really made the mistake is what's been in my mind as I've listened here today is I don't think we did a compelling enough why did we want to have the technology. And I don't think we had the public discourse like we're having right here. And so I think that's what's very important. I think that's my take home that I'm going to think about as we discussed here. I mean, it's venues like this that I think agriculture, we can not only listen, but hopefully we can have that compelling why. Why are these technologies important to us, and why do we need to be able to use them? If it's going to benefit animal welfare, it's going to benefit the environment, I think, well, then we can reach some mutual agreement on the ethical side of it here, in my mind. So
when the way GMOs, and this has been sort of a recurring theme in a lot of the panels, we're talking about how the GMO thing played out, and Sheila Jasanoff was very compelling in the last panel about how this isn't really about facts, this is about conflicting values. And by talking about education, which has been sort of brought up as the antidote to this throughout, this is sort of what the national academies decided didn't work. The deficit model, that people just don't know enough about this, doesn't work. And so what we do when we try and I'm a journalist, I'm trying to bring some sanity to this too. Are we bringing fact checkers to a culture war, and how can we do this better? George?
Yeah, so it's not entirely opinion, or the the facts influence it in terms of how safe and effective something is. So you can have a strongly held opinion that is fact independent until the facts change. So for example, with in vitro fertilization, there was a great repulsion from the potential for monsters that could occur by test tube babies, in scare quotes. But then as soon as we started getting really healthy babies that were the solution to the parents' infertility, the ethics flipped 180 degrees, so that now it was, in a certain sense, unethical to deprive families of having children. I think the same thing can happen in all these cases. If we're just reducing a couple of pennies on per tomato plant, it's hard to explain why that's anything more than a personal choice. But if you're saving 1 million lives a year from vitamin A deficiency, or if you're providing vaccines that eliminate scourges like polio and smallpox and eventually malaria, then it's a different argument altogether. And it is fact-based. It's not just opinion.
And I think that there's certainly widespread agreement that when the first genetically modified organisms, benefited farmers, but any benefit to humans or the environment, and people make the argument that there have been benefits, and I would say that there have been, are certainly less obvious to people, not like saving lives, not like curing disease, not like some of these other potential applications that are on the table. But so much of what we've been talking about here has been inclusion and the various stakeholding communities, and we've had communities of color, we've had communities that are at risk for diseases, we've had religious communities that have been represented here, and so much of the talk has been about how we have to have everybody have a seat at the table. But what are the odds, even with those benefits, in big letters on the marquee, what are the odds that all of these communities are going to agree about this, and what do we do if they don't? Nemo?
Well, I'm not a prophet or a wizard, but I would say that I don't see communities ever agreeing on this.
Me neither.
Because for example, the old type genetic engineering has not delivered on its promises. And there are a lot of issues. For me, I come from Nigeria, and we are still confronting this old technology, the so-called modern biotechnology. And many of us don't want it at all, because what is being sold to us is what has failed elsewhere. And I don't see why I should buy failure. For example, BT cotton failed clearly in Burkina Faso, and the same variety is being promoted in other countries in Africa. It doesn't just make sense. And now, in terms of gene editing, I think it's extreme genetic engineering and can be reserved for extreme situations. For example, here, diseases, treatment for certain very complicated diseases. But in terms of editing the genes of crops for the sake of feeding some people, I think sometimes when scientists look through the window at some continent, look at Africa, say Africans are hungry, or sometimes they say Africa don't have good land, you need to have genetically engineered crops that can survive on those lands. All these are arguments to gain market access. It's also arguments to bring in new forms of control. These are neo-colonial ideas, actually. And it's all about commerce, because in every situation, we have alternatives that need to be promoted. We have alternatives that are suitable for the environment, for culture, for all the ethical considerations, because food is not just a thing that you throw into your mouth and swallow. Food is life, it's a celebration, it's something that is a cultural activity. And if I'm looking at a place I don't understand, food may not look like food. Like if I go to a restaurant across the street, what they offer me may not be what I want to eat. And so if I have the power to engineer and ensure that you get what I can produce in the laboratory, that may not be what I really want. So getting to know what people want is a big problem.
So, but even on this stage here today, we'd have conflicting narratives about how GMOs have delivered, because we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but Randy, I suspect that you would take issue with some of the things that Nemo had said, and there's a lot to talk about there. And the fact that among, 4 people, not counting me, we have, differences of opinion that would be very hard to get beyond. The idea of being able to incorporate this powerful technology in a way that is agreeable to everybody seems a little bit like a pipe dream. And I'm wondering if, George, going back to something that you said about people seeing benefits, is it possible that we can start with what is essentially ethically the low-hanging fruit? So if we start with treatment in one person whose prognosis is very poor, who might die otherwise, and we begin to see how CRISPR can cure disease and make people feel more comfortable until, like with IVF, there's a sea change in how people view this. Is that our best way to consensus?
I think there's a lot to be said for taking serious problems first, but there are plenty of examples where the frivolous has led the way in terms of a new technology, or just the convenient. Cars. I mean, you don't have to get full consensus. First of all, I mean, there are some people who don't want to use cars. There are 1 million people that are killed every year in cars. You could say that's an untested technology, and we don't have consensus on it yet. Nevertheless, people who want to use it can use it. There is a tragedy of the commons occasionally, that innocent pedestrians that don't use a car get killed. I mean, these are complicated issues, but we will see, I think, the first adoption will be very serious diseases. Will be easier to get something approaching consensus. Even there, you won't have full consensus.
But then if we make the leap, I mean, there was a lot of talk about malaria, and well, I sort of feel like I was destined for this topic because my childhood address was 12 Gene Drive. So let's talk about extinguishing mosquitoes in order to benefit humankind. I mean, we have 1,500 people a day dying of malaria. There's some urgency here, but this is going to be a very, very difficult subject on which to build consensus. What do we do about that? Kevin?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is put it in a context that allows us to make this issue accessible to all these different groups we want to include. So for instance, you say, and it's true, it's tragic, 1,500 people dying, how many die from the fact that they don't have access to clean water? More. Oh, should we not talk about malaria then and switch over to clean water? I mean, what kind of parameters are we using to decide what it is we're going to talk about and how we're going to talk about it? Because also you said, and you brought up consensus, and I agree with George, consensus is not always the goal. Mm-hmm. But then again, what are we looking for consensus about? That we are somehow all going to come to an agreement to employ this technology in some particular way? But what if the consensus is that we're all going to agree to discuss the possibility? Now, wouldn't that be an interesting
but hold on.
achievement?
I mean, it's 1,500 people a day. If we were all on the calendar for like next Tuesday, we might feel like that's not getting there fast enough. But somebody is on the calendar for next Tuesday. Is agreeing to discuss really going to get us there?
So if we decide that the ultimate value, right, is to do whatever you can do to extend life, right? Then that has ramifications and consequences for other areas of one's existence. And there are many, many people in the course of human history who, in fact, have been lauded for the fact that they chose not necessarily to extend their life, but to sacrifice themselves for others. Now, I'm not saying this is what's going on with malaria or anything else. What I'm saying is when we choose something like to say, there are these many people dying from this particular disease, we have to do something about it. We have to be careful because that list is enormous. The number of people who are dying every day in this world needlessly, in a sense, right, is something that we've had with us for quite some time and we still struggle with today. We still have very difficult time marshaling the resources to address the most basic needs of people in other parts of the world. We have children under the age of 5 who are dying from diseases that are eminently preventable. So now the question is, and this is why I say, when we throw these things out, I think we have to stop and be careful and not just sort of react instinctively or just with our gut and say, well, that's terrible, let's now all focus on this. Because we'll just be doing one thing after another.
But the reason malaria bubbles to the top of the list is because all of a sudden we have the potential to use a tool that we didn't have before. And Nemo, when you and I were talking about this before, you pointed out that there are other ways to tackle malaria. But this seems like it's a sea change and it's extraordinarily powerful. Is that the case, George?
Well, first of all, we don't need to eliminate the mosquitoes. We could eliminate the malaria parasite, which is fairly human specific, and some people would love to get rid of both of them, but we don't need to. And it's just maybe 1 to 6 species of mosquito out of 3,500 that would be impacted, and they might be made just resistant to the malaria parasite. I think it's more than just people dying. It is true. Everybody's dying, actually. So if we want to get serious about it,
we're in trouble.
Yeah, everybody's dying. But it's the economic impact. It's the things that keeps poor populations poor. It's things like having this burden that other populations don't have. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that in a way that's safe and effective and has the consent of the people affected, then I think that we might be moving towards a win-win, probably without consensus, but you better have something approximating consensus because the mosquitoes that are carrying the malaria do not obey national boundaries.
Right, exactly.
And so if you engineer them in one country, they're going to go into another country. And so you need to have something at the United Nations level, and the United Nations makes a lot of decisions without full consensus. That's what you're going to need.
How comfortable are you with a solution to malaria? And you come from a part of the world, unlike the rest of us here, you come from a part of the world where malaria is rampant. How comfortable are you with using this tool for that disease?
You know, as you mentioned, the mosquitoes don't obey national boundaries. And currently, I believe there are moves to release genetically engineered mosquitoes in Burkina Faso, which is just next to Nigeria. And we are extremely worried about that because, you know, this experiment, you want to eliminate the malaria, the genes that carry the malaria or whatever is being done to eliminate malaria. It sounds like a good idea. But to me, beyond using the technology to fight a disease of this nature, we also see the possibilities of the technology being used for other purposes because, it could easily manipulate insects or whatever to carry pathogens that would eliminate populations of human beings. Because we don't see the situation in the world today where powerful countries or corporations care about people who are not the same as them. We see the destruction of places like Syria, Libya. You could just bomb and kill thousands of people and nobody says anything. So if you have a situation of this kind of power and control in the world where there's no equity in terms of global relationships, and you could have a situation where these seemingly scientifically nice inventions or creations can become extremely dangerous. So I would say, as we discussed earlier, there are easy ways to tackle malaria. It's about sanitation. It's about stopping stagnant waters. It's about governments investing in social services. And if people just want quick fix solutions, techno fixes, I think we're moving on the wrong path.
if there weren't issues of consensus, of local buy-in, of a deepening divide, if there were just one person making a decision based on what is the risk as far as ecosystem impact versus what is the benefit of trying to eliminate or seriously put a dent in malaria, if you could make the decision yourself, would you do it tomorrow? To release something into the wild that would either eliminate the mosquito or you take your pick of which solution it is. Would you do it tomorrow?
No.
Would you do it tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow we haven't gone through safety testing, so no. It takes a while to do all that testing.
Yeah, right.
And you know whether we do the safety testing or not for malaria, it doesn't address your question of whether it's going to be abused. In fact, to some extent, if we don't get good practices in place for using it for important health and poverty-related, wealth-related issues, then the only people that will be practicing this technology are your worst nightmares, right?
But that's an interesting question. What do we do about the worst nightmares? We haven't quite gotten to the point where you can do it in the bathtub, but apparently that's the direction that we're going in. And pretty soon, somebody scientifically savvy will be able to do it in her home. And when we talk about laws and guidelines and ethics, we're talking about people who pay attention to laws and guidelines and ethics. What do we do about bad actors? What do we do about a technology that is so powerful that people can do it without reference to these things? Kevin?
I was wondering, who's she going to pick for that one?
I'm so glad that I get to ask the questions. I don't have to answer.
That's right. Again, if we look in the course of human history at times when one group was afraid of another group and how the other group might act in a way that would be harmful to the one group, you've got a variety of options, right? One is you can try and go in and take out the other group, and then, of course, that leads to all kinds of problems. The other is to go in and try to win them over, become friends, connect with them, find out why you are at this impasse. So this actually raises a fascinating question for me personally, and I've asked some friends who do history of science and technology. Might this be a moment in human history where we have created technologies that are actually going to force us to be nicer to one another? Because A, we benefit if we have more genetic information from different people around the world, especially marginalized communities, but B, it would also help us all sleep a lot better if we thought we know what everybody else is thinking about as far as using this technology. What are their goods and their goals? And hopefully, none are going to be, let's use this to see how many people we can kill,
Well,
right? Or if we can get rid of that other group.
Other powerful technologies, like, say, nuclear weapons, don't seem to have taken us down that path.
Or maybe they have,
optimistic for
actually,
this
in someone.
Oh, have they?
Sure. I mean, in the sense that up until the development of nuclear weapons, right, we had a little more trouble limiting the use of the weapons that we developed, except, well, chemical weapons, which, of course, World War I, which was horrendous, and then people saw the results of that. And so they anticipated, and we've done a bit, I think we could make the argument historically better with nuclear weapons as far as using them. Not necessarily building them, but using them. So the question here is, have we broached a beachhead with biological weapons that actually is going to force us to have to be even more careful, even more restrained, even more interconnected in order for us to be able to say with at least some semblance of security that we feel good about where things are. And so I agree, we're going to have to move in that direction. The technology itself is going to force us to.
So the closest thing so far that we've had to, a technology that affects all of us because it's unleashed out there in the world are some of the crops that you're growing on your farm. And they have had mixed effects, some good, some bad, and we can have that discussion too. But given what you've seen as far as the ability that you have to grow crops versus, say, the resistance of some of the weeds that have developed around glyphosate, what do you think we need to be watching for on the agricultural side as far as risk?
Thanks for the question. It's a great question. I was actually content listening. I'm learning very well here from those that are up here, and so appreciate the opportunity. I view myself as a caretaker, and the lens that I make decisions on, each and every day we talk about sustainability. Society's charged me as a caretaker to make those decisions not only for me and my family, but also for society. And how those decisions impact the environment, how they impact the economic, as we talked about, food availability and cost for a large portion of society, but also then the ethical side of it here. And so I think it's very important that, in the discussion here, that innovation and technology when it comes to agriculture is very important. And so I think that's what's great about having this discussion here. And so I think, although we saw it on the list as we were stepping up here that oversight was ranking really low, I do believe that society, that's a required what needs to be had, that we have a robust oversight of these technologies. So I'm relying on that also. But I think it's part of the discourses I listen to here on that risk. It's not only the risk of the technology, it's a risk of lack of acceptance by society. We've had many examples as crops that I produce that, and also on the animal side that, we want to make sure that society is comfortable. And I think that's basically the main change in agriculture here. I see agricultural listening. I see agricultural wanting to be part of the dialogue, and I think that's what's so great about this. We need to continue on with that. And so when it comes to those risks, I think we need to make sure that there's a strong regulatory oversight, plus also then the risks that society has, that we can listen to what their concerns are, and so bring those back.
And you come to this with a very pronounced perspective on this. You've used these crops, you're comfortable with these crops, you've seen the advantages of these crops. And in the last panel, I think we saw the wizard and prophet dynamic going on face to face between Gideon and Sheila Jasanoff about exactly these kinds of questions of public acceptance. And as a journalist, one of the things that keeps me up at night is what I get wrong. What are my biases? How can I make sure that I don't go down the rabbit hole of either wizard or prophet, whatever my mindset is on a particular issue? And I think it's a little bit different on different issues. How do you guard against your own bias? Or worldview is a nicer word, but that's what it is.
I parked my elephant at the curb.
Oh, has anybody read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind? Julie referenced it before, and he's got this great metaphor of the elephant and the rider, where we're all an elephant and a rider, and our elephant is this sum total of what makes us a wizard or a prophet. It's our values, it's our cultural affiliations, it's our intuition, our emotions. And the rider is our intellectual part, and it turns out that the rider's job is to justify the decision the elephant makes. It's a very disheartening view of human behavior. But I was very persuaded by it, and one of the most difficult things about it is that if you buy into this, and there's not really a whole lot of disagreement that this is how the human mind works, you don't have access to your elephant. You can't summon him and give him a good talking to. And so how do we try and protect ourselves from ourselves? Kevin, you think a lot about these issues. What do you do?
So I love the metaphor too. It was very interesting, right? Especially the elephant just heading off whatever direction the elephant wants to go. But interestingly, I think I've met some people where the elephant is riding the person. So there's just so little emotion there, and there's all this intellect, and you think, okay, that's going to be interesting. So one of the ways in which you can do that is, again, getting back to this goal, right? What's the goal? If the goal is consensus, then that can be fine. Then I think we have to have had a consensus that that's the goal is consensus. What often does better is engaging people who think very, very differently than you, actively openly looking for a kind of synthesis that you wouldn't have otherwise, because you would never come up with that particular solution on your own, and neither would the other person. But in engaging that other person and recognizing the fact that there is an impasse in certain ways, one is then forced to look in other directions. It's somewhat similar to your colleague, the farmer from New York, who said that when they switched to organic, they discovered methodologies they wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So if we force ourselves at times to be uncomfortable, if we force ourselves to engage those other people who have very different elephants than we do, I think what we can find out is there are maybe ways of hurting the elephants that we had never before anticipated, because we just never threw ourselves into that arena, and we're never forced to really move in that direction. Why would we do that? We would do that to meet our goals, which are to get to the goods that we want in a way that is more acceptable and even more beneficial to people, which is going to depend on them seeing it as beneficial, not just us telling them it is.
And that goes back to, George, what you said about IVF, that these have to be bona fide advantages. These have to be benefits that people can reap and see in their own lives. But, I mean, it's hard to imagine doing what you do and having done what you've done and not be comfortable with this technology because you've been working with it for so long. Do you ever worry that your comfort level with the technology might lead you to underplay some of the risks? Or does it make you even more aware of the risks?
Yeah, I don't know about elephants. I mean, I think they have fact-based reasoning as well. So if you put some food in there, off to the right, they probably can go off to the right. So they're not unpredictable. In terms of my own bias, I'm sure I have many, but I think they may be contrary to what you might expect. So because I can see the technologies way in advance, I have a tendency to bring it to the public attention way in advance. So that makes me neither advocate nor critic. It's just saying, watch out. There's something out there to watch out for. So I'm kind of like canary in the coal mine, or a lighthouse or something, right? And at that, I mean, certainly I have a bias towards technological fixes, which I realize are not panaceas. But if we don't have them, we have less choice, okay? And the important thing is to have choice. Just because we develop them, if we bring the cost down, that increases the choice as well, right? But you need to keep saying we don't have to do it just because it's available and cheap. We have to think about long-term unintended consequences. We need to think about neocolonialism. We need to think about all the ways it can be abused, for sure. So I think one of the ways that we all overcome our biases is we have conversations with people who do not see eye to eye with us. And the more frequently we do that and the more courteous we are about that, we can slightly vaccinate ourselves against our elephant going completely amok.
I actually think it's one of the best things about this conference, that there's so many different perspectives on just about every panel. But you talked about how we don't do it just because we can. But are there moral imperatives that push us to do it? If you figure out that there is a disease that you can cure, a pest you can eradicate, something that has benefits that are very significant and risks that are smaller or manageable, and you see the gap is big enough, does that light a fire under researchers to try and go out and do this? Do you have an obligation to pursue that?
I think researchers do feel an obligation to at least develop the framework and the potential, not necessarily to make the final decision about whether they're going to be used in what situation or not. Very often they're wrong. For example, the introduction of cane toads into Australia was a thought-out process. I mean, we probably didn't have international agreement on it, but it was a scientist was involved. The scientists were involved. Removing wolves from some of the national parks there was some reasoning that went into it, and it didn't necessarily work out.
I believe there were goats in the Galapagos.
And the goats are now being eliminated from the Galapagos. So things can seem like a good idea at the time, and it's, we're getting better at very long-term reasoning, but we're still, that's one of the problems.
And I think that this is some of the objections that you have raised, some of the objections that have been raised about GMOs and that have been raised in general are exactly that how good are we at predicting what's going to happen when we put something out in the environment. And I guess it's with some trepidation that I invoked Donald Rumsfeld, but he had a point with the unknown unknowns. Mm-hmm. And here's this brand new thing. How do we get better at assessing risk? I'm going to stay with you on this one for a second.
Sorry. I think the main thing we want is reversibility. So the only way we're going to find out about the unknown opportunities as well as risk is to take baby steps in that direction. Ideally do it, like for example, there are ways to test things in closed containers.
Mm-hmm.
There are even enclosed villages that you can do these things. But we need to have reversibility. We need to have physical and biological containment wherever possible. And we need to test all of those things constantly in the most innocuous setting to make sure that they work. Don't just do it on theory alone. You need to mm-hmm. show that in a low risk situation they don't escape unless you. But yeah.
Nemo, does that make you more comfortable? Reversibility?
How would you engineer reversibility? That's another part of the technology. And so you have to be certain that it can be reversed once you release the living organism into the environment. And I think it's it will take a long time to be sure that can happen because it may not happen. But let me quickly say that what I think is what drives some of this science. I mean, science is good. What drives some of this science is the premise that is reached through certain kinds of considerations. For example, we talk about the fact that the population of the world is increasing and cannot be fed except you use technology to produce the food. But at the moment, how much food is wasted? 30% of food produced goes to waste every day. And about the same quantity goes to feed animals and machines. So we have enough food in the world today to feed the population that we're projecting. Up to can feed 9 billion people without any problems. But the issue is, with some problems. Not in terms of, but the problem is not production. There are other issues about food, about people have access to the food, people having the right kind of food. There's so many people wasting food. These are the issues that we need to consider before we say, we cannot feed this number of people. And of course, the population of the world will not keep on increasing on a linear scale. That would only happen if we don't take care of certain social conditions. So there are many things we can put into the equation that will show that the question we're asking are not the right questions.
So I think that this is a conversation that happens a lot among people who are more comfortable with the technology and less comfortable with the technology. When we talk about what some of the benefits are, there are other ways to solve those problems. But these are big, hairy problems. The fact that there are other approaches for them, does that mean we should take this technology off the table?
Well, the fact that we have a technology does not mean that we should use it. We've seen it in the case of the atomic bomb. We don't drop atomic bombs everywhere there's war. So it's good to develop it, keep it in a contained situation in the laboratories, and perfect it, develop it. Maybe one day in 200 years, it may be useful and controllable. But I don't see in the short term, how well we can control it.
At the end of the day, it's hard not to come back to the idea that there's a right answer to some of these questions. If we can balance the risk and benefits, if we can foresee some of the unknowns, if we can do the safety testing, if we can get good at assessing the risk, at some point, if we can say, this technology is going to save this number of lives, what if there is a right answer and communities or populations reject it. And this came up in the last panel as well. Can majority rule be wrong? Can people forego important technologies that can save other people's lives because they're uncomfortable with it? Start with you, Kevin.
Sure. Of course, it's a fascinating premise that there's a right answer. How do you define right answer? For whom and under what conditions? So one might shift it a little bit and say, is there a best answer? And is that answer not necessarily the same for everyone? So in terms of saying, we don't need a one-size-fits-all solution sort of approach here. It's a very flexible technology. We've just been finding out the last couple of days how many times they've now taken the Cas protein and modified it or found other variants of the Cas protein. So I think one of the things we have to take into consideration is the fact that we don't need to look for one solution for all these different situations, not even for malaria. All right. So in addition, when we're talking about how do we balance benefit and risk, we do that every day. Every one of us does that every day. So why don't we just stop and say, well, how do we do that every day? Well, we do it in part because we recognize the fact that in order to get this, I've got to take this risk, and I acknowledge I'm taking this risk, even if it's sort of semi-conscious. I get in the car. How many people die? You know, 1 million people? All right. I still get in the car. I still go, right? So what if we present these technologies in a similar way of saying, we can't guarantee anything. I can guarantee you one thing. Things will go wrong. We cannot anticipate everything that's going to happen. I can guarantee that. So having that guarantee, now, do you still want to do it? So that when people then become engaged, they've already said, yes, we understand we're taking a risk, but we think the risk is worth it. And for people who don't think the risk is worth it, then you say there are alternatives. Now, the challenge you're going to have is when you have a situation that is affecting both groups and they want to go in different directions, and whether or not that'll be possible.
And I think that and again, because this is still new, it's still evolving. There are very few examples where we can say, yes, we know that these are the benefits and these are the risks, and we're going to weigh them. But this is, I think it's something that we can foresee. And is Kevin Esfeld still here?
Yeah.
Because his take on this was so interesting when he talked about Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and the fact that for him, the way to make to make the decision was to let the community make the decision about how these mice were going to be treated. They decided they wanted to go ahead with the project, but they didn't want Gene Drive involved in this, and that was the decision they made. But is that always going to be the case? Sometimes communities make choices that larger societies condemn, and we don't have to look very far for that. What if the community says we want to fly the Confederate flag, or we want to leave up the Confederate statutes? There are lots of people who are willing to say, no, that's a wrong decision. And given that this is such a fraught issue and we have so much on the table, how are we going to negotiate these situations?
Well, just again, using approaches we've used successfully in the past, there's a thing called the principle of subsidiarity. And the idea is to say one tries as best one can to solve the situation on as small a local level as you can. But again, since we're talking about, as we've said, technologies that don't pay attention to borders,
right.
I think the challenge is going to be to say, with these technologies, we probably will have to do international negotiations. We will have to do global discussions. Why? Because if we put something out there, it isn't necessarily going to stay as contained, and I know Kevin was saying that's what he wants, contained and reversible. But again, how contained, how reversible, what are we going to be able to guarantee? So the technology itself, in a sense, pushes us toward this more international and global conversation.
I want to ask one more question before we switch over to the audience questions. And again, versions of this have come up in previous panels. Obviously, the GMO debate wasn't just about GMOs. It was about corporate involvement in our food supply. It was about patenting. It was about an industrialized food supply that goes into cars and pigs and Twinkies and not so much nourishes humans. There are all kinds of issues there. Given that CRISPR has some things going for it that are the opposite. It comes out of academic institutions. Even though it's going to be patented, there's a commitment to make it widely available. A lot of the people who are working on it are committed to improving our food supply. Do you think that's enough to overcome what people have proven to the hesitations that people have been proven to have when we're talking about gene editing? And I guess, Nemo, we'll start with you.
Well,
doesn't seem to overcome your objections.
no. I don't know. No. There are very deep issues concerning gene editing because, especially if it involves let's say humans, in the germline. So you're not talking about one generation, you are talking about multiple generations. And they don't have they don't have a say in what's going to happen to them. So this is a very, very weighty thing to consider before anybody takes that kind of step. We're not dealing with inanimate objects, we're living with living beings. And in fact, when I think about gene editing, the magnitude and the possibilities, it's almost like think about geoengineering. You're trying to control the climate by human beings, by putting mirrors in the clouds or sulfides or whatever. And the problem with this is that the experiment in environment is not small scale. Mm-hmm. So you cannot say I'm releasing these rats in one village and then see what's going to happen. It's going to spread because these are living organisms. So it's really, really not a thing to be done lightly at all. And I think we should put a lid on it.
Randy, you're on the front lines. And my guess is you don't completely agree with Nemo here. But do you think that we have a chance for a different public trajectory for CRISPR than we did for GMOs?
That's why I hopped off the tractor to be here. I mean, that's facetious, but I think that's true. I think agriculture needs to engage. In other words, while I might not be talking as much as the respected individuals, I think I represent agriculture that we're listening. We realize with the GMO debate that I think we miss the why. I mean, we miss the opportunity to tell the society the benefits from the environmental side that could be shown. And so I think that's what we hope to change in the discourse and the conversation is to be able to listen here, to hear the concerns, and there again, to preserve that innovation that what I believe we really need in food animal production and in livestock production.
So with that, let's go to some of the audience questions. And the first one is, how is eliminating malaria different from eliminating smallpox with vaccines? And Nemo, if you want to tackle that first.
Very short answer to that is that smallpox was fought with vaccines applied by humans into the kids or whoever's body. The proposal for malaria, to tackle malaria, is to not to put a vaccine in a human being, but to edit the genes of another living being, living organism, and then releasing that to the environment. So the implications are wider than just treating the malaria.
Do you see it that way?
Yes. I think George had a very good distinction between, are we going to use the genetic engineering to attack the mosquito or to attack the plasmodium? I mean, that makes a big difference which way you're going.
George, do you see them as different?
Yes, they're different. I'm not worried about whether it's a quick fix or not. The exact amount of time that it takes is not necessarily threatening. I mean, I don't think we need to wait 200 years to test polio vaccine, for example. Polio is a nice example of something that is not bounded by country boundaries. It goes across country boundaries, and where a minority can rule. A minority can say, we're not going to vaccinate my village, and then that village goes out and spreads it throughout the whole world after it was almost eliminated. So I think we need to be very, very cautious about, on both sides, of things that, new technologies that can act swiftly and can be a net positive, even if you don't have full consensus.
And the next question is specifically about the one thing that Feng Zhang thought was off limits, which is germline editing. Why is that sort of an ethical no-go area right now, and do you perceive that as continuing for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, Feng and I agree on many things. He was a postdoctoral fellow in my lab. I disagree with him on this particular point because I think that right now the standard of practice is if you have a couple that are where they have a high probability of having children that are severely genetically diseased, the main option is abortion or in vitro fertilization, which is a form of abortion in the minds of many people. The alternative would be engineering the sperm, which can be done in a clonal manner, so you can actually check that you did it only on target, nothing off target. You don't get mosaic embryos, and you would eliminate this particular need for an abortion as a way of preventing that birth. So I think that we need to cautiously see if that is safe and effective, rather than just banning it at blanket. What we have right now, and what motivated that question, is in the United States we have a ban on the FDA even considering safety and efficacy testing. They cannot approve, they can't even recognize that anybody's applied for safety and efficacy testing of something that would make an infertile man sperm work or cure a disease like Tay-Sachs in a couple that where both people are carriers.
Is that a compelling line of
So
reasoning?
I think, again, we have to put this in proper context. In talking about a ban for germline genetic editing, I think most of people's hesitancy with germline editing comes from safety and efficacy, as George was mentioning. However, there's also the issue that Nemo raises, which is the idea of what right do we have, and it's not to say we don't because we do it all the time, what right do we have to do something now that's going to affect future generations for the foreseeable future? So the question is, when we make this decision, and just to let you know, there was a document that came out of the International Theological Commission, and I think it was in 2003 from the Vatican, that said, theoretically, germline human genetic engineering be fine if it was in balance the right thing to do, the better thing to do, right? So it's, again, I don't think it's, for most people, the idea that somehow there's this sort of theoretical ban ever doing it. The real question that is we're going to have to continue to wrestle with once we get past safety and efficacy is making that decision for future generations, which, as I mentioned, we already do in other areas. So how do we make an analogous argument there? Because, again, your germline has other aspects to it other than mere physiological.
Well, we're only making that decision for future generations when we do an abortion.
Yeah.
So it's a question is,
many ways.
Given that we're making that decision, which is the better way to do it, with or without abortions? I think that's one way of framing it.
And I think we're going to have to leave it there. I've gotten the flag. So please thank an excellent panel.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.